Ever wonder why the media seems biased against Israel? Recently, we talked with Mati Friedman, a former AP reporter, on how the mainstream media presents a skewed version of Israel. Well, Mati, thanks for joining us here on Jerusalem Dateline. You wrote an article called The Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. Why did you write it?
As a correspondent for a long time for the AP, which is one of the biggest news organizations in the world, I realized by the end of my time there that something had badly malfunctioned in press coverage of Israel. And as an Israeli, it was deep concern to me, and it kind of came to a head this summer because of the events in Gaza and because of the way those events were covered and the outrage that that it sparked abroad. And I decided at the end of the summer to write an essay looking at what has gone wrong through the lens of my own experiences.
So when you watched the coverage of the Gaza war over the summer, what bothered you?
If you look at the staffing in the mainstream media organizations, this conflict is covered as if it were the most important story on Earth. That's why the title of my essay is An Insider's Guide to the Most Important Story on Earth. When I started working for the AP in 2006, the AP had more than 40 full-time news staffers covering Israel and the Palestinians, which is 12 million people, more or less, which was more than they had covering China, which is 1.3 billion people. They had at the same time one part-time staffer in Syria. So Israel was more than 40 times as important as Syria. When the Gaza fighting erupted this summer, 700 journalists flew to Israel to cover the fighting on top of all the permanent correspondents who are already here, which is one of the largest press contingents on Earth. In Mexico between 2006 and 2012, 60,000 people died in drug wars along the US border. And that was covered far less. The mainstream press corps here has largely adopted an advocacy role. They've decided to play a political role in the conflict. They've decided to lobby for the side that they think is right. And political decisions are disguised as journalistic decisions. And I give examples of that in my essay. And I think we saw that very much this summer, where the war, because that's what it was portrayed as a one-sided Israeli aggression against innocent people in Gaza, which was a picture that is false.
In the war itself, what were some of the examples that you can cite?
I think any observer looking at Gaza, at these recurring rounds in Gaza, understands that Hamas has a very smart strategy. It's a ruthless strategy, but it is highly effective. The strategy is to terrorize Israeli civilians using rockets, provoke an Israeli response, put civilians in Gaza in between the Israelis and the Hamas fighters by storing weapons, storing rockets in civilian basements, in the basements of mosques, in schools, and we've seen all those things documented this summer. And then having the huge international media contingent in Gaza film the civilian casualties, not the armed men, and use those pictures to spark outrage against Israel abroad, and that will prevent Israel from acting to the full extent of its strength against Hamas. That's the strategy. I think any intelligent person can see it, and yet it's not covered like that.
So do readers around the world get a skewed version of what's actually happening here?
Absolutely. I think readers are getting a one-sided morality play, kind of another morality play from the Holy Land, the kind of thing that's programmed, I think, deep into the Western DNA, where it becomes a story of, not a story of a tiny minority enclave of 6 million Jews in an Arab world of 300 million people and an Islamic world of 1 billion people, not the story of a country that exists on 0.2% of the landmass of the Arab world. What you're getting is a story of Jewish moral failure. The story is, if you read between the lines and if you read the lines themselves, the story is that Israel is faced with a clear moral choice and is making the wrong choice. Israel could have peace, but it chooses war. That story is false.
In the last part of your article, you allude to that and the reasons. Why are the reasons for that?
A few different things are going on here. Some of them are quite mundane.
Right.
Some of them have to do with the bureaucracies of large organizations. There are a lot of reporters here. And when you have a lot of reporters, they need to have something to do, else someone might notice that they don't have anything to do and someone might fire them. Of course, as a journalist, you probably get that. Another aspect of it is that this is a really easy story to report, and reporters don't like to admit it. But when you're here, you get to cover a conflict. You can be in the field 10 o'clock in the morning in a flak jacket, having yourself filmed, and by 3 o'clock, you'll be back in a safe, liberal city like Tel Aviv, or here in Jerusalem, drinking drinking beers inside a security bubble provided to you by the soldiers who you might have just that morning been implying were war criminals. The obsession develops around Jews. And you can't discuss this place without admitting that this is the world's only Jewish country. Now, if you look at the West, you'll see that the sins that animate people in the West, and especially liberals in the West, are colonialism, militarism, and racism. And certainly those characteristics exist in the United States and in all societies. But the country that has been selected to serve as the example of those sins is the Jewish country. And I think that that's a direct descendant of very old thinking about Jewish people.
Mati, thanks so much for being with us and for your article.
Thank you for having me on your show, Chris.